a red sign and take 10 seconds. Hi everyone, here we are today, Sunday morning in a holiday bridge, and we are thankful that everyone is here watching this session with Professor Willian Bender, which is my pleasure to introduce and actually invite you, those who didn't watch his video, to do it. It's a fantastic video about real life experience in teaching using project-based learning, problem-based learning, and other elements that I think is connected with our conference, which is the active learning education, let's put it this way. And so it's a pleasure to have Professor Bender here. And first of all, I'd like to know if he wants to make any introduction about him or his work, and before we move to make some questions to him. The questions that were raised in the chat by those who watched the video.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm Dr. Willian Bender. First, accept my apology for yesterday. I was waiting in an incorrect StreamYard room for the telecast, and we didn't find each other until afterwards, and it was entirely my responsibility. So please, I had 2,500 educators waiting on me, and I do apologize.
It was a miscommunication.
You're being very kind.
Yes, we were in different rooms, actually. But
you're being very kind. Yes, my background was very similar to many of you educators there. I taught in public schools for a number of years. I was dealing with special needs populations and always looking for strategies at work. I think it was in the public school classroom where I really developed my passion for research-proven strategies that really could be applied in the classroom, not some pie in the sky theoretical thing, but things that really worked. And after I got my doctorate, I taught in university settings at Rutgers University and the University of Georgia, teaching teachers for many years how to work with that same challenging group of students. I wrote a number of educational books, and as I say, all of them tended to follow that practical application thing, things on differentiating instruction in reading or math or brain compatible instruction. I know Ulysses has done some work with Dr. Gardner on in that realm. More recently, I've been working with kids who had experienced trauma in their life. My most recent publication was in the videos, a book published in 2020 about teaching through trauma, teaching kids who have been exposed to trauma. But again, one of my favorite strategies is today's topic, project-based education, because it does seem to cut across all of the ability spectrum. It can work with kids. This was one of the questions we'll address a little later, but it can work with kids with certain types of disabilities, mild and moderate disabilities. It can also work very well with gifted or accelerated kids and every kid in between. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you, perhaps working with you in the future. I also would like to say the list of questions that I've received are excellent questions. I'm looking forward to getting into those.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, so we got over 50 questions to Professor Bender, a lot of comments, people thanking him for the nice video and ideas and suggestions. As I mentioned yesterday, and I mentioned again today, he put some videos in his video saying that they can be found on YouTube. So it's a reminder for people here in Brazil that when you find these videos on YouTube, you can put a subtitle to Portuguese, and it does a good translation. So don't mind about his showing videos. It's in English, but you can find those videos and set on YouTube to watch with a subtitle in Portuguese. It's important for us to better understand his experience. But let's move forward. As we say, we came here for what, right? For questions and answers from Professor Bender, taking his nice time. So we're going to start with a set of questions that a lot of people made on the chat, and then I organized them in one questions, and I'm going to read here for him. A group of questions raises the perspective that in a country like Brazil, continental and diverse, there are some extra challenges in adopting the PBL approach due to the lack of infrastructure in schools. That students from low socioeconomic classes have no access to the internet and to mobile gadgets like cell phones and things like that, or computers. Can you provide some comments about how to face this challenge, like engaging the students in PBL activities without the use of technology and considering the diversity?
I told you this is an excellent question. And the first thing I want to share with you is that it comes up worldwide. In my own personal experience, I traveled to the Crow Indian Reservation. Now, that group of people is a group of indigenous peoples. We call them First Americans or Native Americans here in the United States. But the large Crow Reservation was half a continent away from where I'm based, out in Billings, Montana, south of Billings, Montana. And I ran into exactly the same question there. We were talking about what to do with this indigenous population of kids who had some economic challenges in that area, low socioeconomic basis in that area, and very few of them had any access to mobile devices. They did have internet capability at the school, so there was some limited computer availability, but it wasn't something that the kids could take out into the community, work on at home and that type of thing. So it forced me back then to reflect, how do you do project-based learning? Some of these other things, other strategies. In looking at that question with PBL, I came across an article from the Washington Post, one of our large newspapers in Washington, D.C. The article was published about a year ago, but it pointed out that project-based learning dates from around 1919 or 1920. Decades and decades before the internet evolved, before mobile devices and Web 2.0 technologies evolved. And so what it forced the issue, you have to think about project-based learning in terms of the basics of it. On page 21 in my book, which has been translated into Portuguese, there's a list of activities which you do in project-based learning: brainstorming, research. The research tools you would use would not be Web 2.0 tools. You'd have no mobile devices, no internet access. You would have to do things such as interviews with community leaders if your project-based learning group is addressing a project. In the video, I showed a little example where a second grade project-based learning group was evaluating a city park to see if they could recommend additional improvements to the park and increase utilization. And what you may recall from that little segment of video, second grade kids were taking a simple notebook and a pencil, walking through the park in pairs, discussing areas that they could see that would improve the park, making a note of them, and then they were going to synthesize that information and present it back to the city council in that particular PBL. So tools such as you have to have some research tools of some type. It may be as simple as an encyclopedia in a community library or a public school. It may be books, textbooks, interviews with community leaders, the types of ways that persons would have solved problems at the community level in 1920 before Web 2.0 tools existed will be the types of tools you use. And you can do effective project-based learning based on that. If there's a little bit of enhancement, perhaps some web availability in a computer or two at a local school or library, that can be helpful. Maybe a small group of the PBL group of students will access information there. But encyclopedias still work. Books still work. Interviews in the community still work. Observation of things in the community still work. And so PBL can be done on that basis. And again, that's an excellent question.
Great. Moving to another question that was made by Nubia Faria. Can you talk about the possibilities of implementing PBL in non-formal, informal educational spaces? She gives an example like a science museum, for example.
I can, is depending, the answer to that is going to depend on the educational space. And Ulysses, you and I had discussed several areas, several museums and what they were looking at fostering. First of all, you will begin the project in the same way. You'll try to have the students identify an issue, a problem, something they would like to address. Again, student voice and student choice is very important in project-based learning because that's where some of the motivation comes from. If the students feel they have some choices, they're going to be more motivated. But you will then juxtapose that or partner that with whatever resources are available at that community setting, the library or the museum or the science museum or what have you. One of the things that many science museums today are doing is augmented learning. Again, that puts you back using some of the Web 2.0 tools, but students carry around a little iPad and they look at an exhibit in the museum, and if it's keyed with augmented learning capability of that particular exhibit is, they hold up a little iPad and the iPad reveals a whole bunch of data that's not on the placard in the exhibit museum, or it reveals perhaps an experiment that the students could later do. So it depends. To interface PBL with community resources, you have to look at what those resources are and how they apply to the student-driven question.
Yeah, I like this perspective. Personally, when working with teachers' professional development, I used to tell them the most difficult thing we have when working with teachers is convincing them that they have to listen to the students.
Oh, yeah.
Usually we are prepared in our universities and everywhere to teach, to tell
to direct
what we know, what they should know.
Yes.
And the first step would be what students want to learn about the contents, the subject we are working, right? So it is an exercise that I think everyone should pay attention. We have to listen to the students. That's in the way that Professor Bender just said. Yeah.
If I may add a bit more to that,
yeah,
there is something of a mindset change on the part of teachers when they move into project-based learning. As they do it more, they will see more of the value of letting students have more choices. And that is one constant refrain I have heard from teachers who have made this transition. They see the value in terms of motivation and increased student engagement when the students are heard in terms of what they would like to study and how they'd like to look at it. So you're right on point there, Ulysses.
Yeah, this is a question that came in the chat. It's not in the list that we sent to you previously, but it is a couple people make this kind of question about motivation because it was clear in your video. That's why I didn't put in the list of questions, but
makes sense.
Raising this point. Okay, Euler Silva made a question about an important issue: assessment. Okay, when we move to a different type of education, like project-based learning and things like that, assessment, because we have to assess the students.
Yes, certainly.
And so how to do it in this perspective of project-based learning, problem-based learning? Can you talk more about that?
Yes, there are two answers. Initially, they seem to be in some conflict with each other, but they are really not. The first answer, in the United States, we have gone through a standards-based instruction movement that has resulted in a plethora of end of course examinations, end of year examinations, and things. In other words, formal assessments that were devised by folks other than the teacher in that classroom, that the students must pass in order to move on to their next year of education. So in some ways, that assessment is a real thing here in the United States, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So we have to address that. Now, with that reality, teachers can prepare students using project-based learning if they supplement it with additional ongoing traditional assessments in the within the project itself. In other words, when the students complete a project, I know of one school that was referred to in my video, a high school in Minnesota, where the students in the high school were literally handed a copy of the standards and say, these are your ninth grade standards in mathematics. By the end of the year, the various projects that you design must address all of these standards and must address it to the satisfaction of the teachers who will review those projects. Now, in addition to that emphasis on traditional assessment, the types of assessment that are strongly emphasized in project-based learning, I did a chapter on this in the book, were things such as rubrics, teachers developing structures for students, or for that matter, students themselves developing a rubric as part of the project. How will we be evaluated on this at the end? There does tend to be an increase in self-evaluation, reflective evaluation, and perhaps even peer evaluation in project-based learning. Were I trying to transition to project-based learning myself and looking at an academic calendar for a year, I wouldn't put a peer evaluation in every single project I was doing, but I would make certain that that type of evaluation was represented there. I would make sure that a self-evaluation was represented there in some of the projects. If you think about it, many of us are asked, I was asked as a university professor to kind of self-evaluate myself on a yearly basis for merit pay or promotion when my promotion years came around. So a combination of the types of assessments that are strongly emphasized, the rubrics, a self, a peer, and just a simple question, did the project work? Did the project solve the problem we set out to solve? Those types of things from project-based learning, coupled with more traditional assessments interspersed throughout the school year, and then year-end course evaluation, evaluations on course content. The assessment issue, once you move into project-based learning and do those two kind of tiered things, the assessment issue begins to take care of itself. It truly does.
Yeah.
Great question.
I totally agree. I personally, when I work with project-based learning, with at the university level, in other levels, 10% of the final grade is based on peer-to-peer assessment.
Oh, okay.
And also self-evaluation. 5% in each one of the final grade. So it's two important tools to realize when you do this kind of work. And
go ahead. I'll say one other thought on that. That is the way people are going to assess themselves throughout a career. I mean, as I began to look at Brazil as a thriving economy, a technologically based economy, and looked at, you guys are producing things worldwide, and, the types of industries that have evolved in the last 50 years in your economy, particularly managers and senior managers, they're going to be doing self-evaluation all the time, and then handing that to their superiors. Say, here's part of my,
We have to learn that.
Exactly.
That's the point. And one important thing that you mentioned that is not many people in Brazil are used to that. So I would suggest the Brazilian teachers here watching us to pay attention in the term Professor Bender used, which is rubric, rubricas in Portuguese.
Okay.
This is something that is getting really important for this kind to get out of the traditional evaluation that we have in schools, to adopt this perspective of rubricas. Okay, now we have a question that I think goes to your main motivation today, trauma. Monica Fleming got, from your presentation, of course. Can you say something about how to adopt PPL when working with children with trauma?
First of all, that's another excellent question. It forced me to kind of go back and reflect on two things in my career that I've done that I really haven't interfaced as well as I should. One is the work on project-based learning. The other one is my more recent work on working with students with trauma who have lived through trauma. I had some notes that I made about that. First thought, and again, Monica, excellent question. The first thought on that was, when working with students with trauma, teachers are often challenged to find anything that will connect with the student, anything that can be. Those students are often very closed in emotionally. If you think about it, emotional closure and withdrawal is a self-protective mechanism that often results from childhood trauma, whether it's childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse, neglect, or what have you. If you can find a way, and this is going to be it's going to be independent from one student to another. If you can find a way to use the trauma as a motivational tool, perhaps even a focal point for what that particular child could contribute to a group project, sometimes you can open up that, I call them repeatedly traumatized student, and invite them to participate more with their friends. Sometimes, I can't tell you how many kids that I've worked with or where I've encouraged teachers to literally tell a student, because of what you've been through, you have a perspective that the rest of us need to hear. If we can invite the student, and here again, it depends on the student's willingness, openness, their self-protective mechanisms, but if we can invite them to use their trauma as a perspective that gives them something to contribute that other students don't have, sometimes you can use the trauma itself to open up that student. That was one of my things. Use it. I use the phrase in my teaching through trauma book as a way in, as a connection with that student that will allow the teacher to begin to get inside the student, to open them up more, to Now, another quick thought I had was use journaling. In my trauma book, not necessarily in the project-based learning book, but students keeping journals. Repeatedly traumatized students, or I call them students who were raised in a war zone or raised in hell, horrible family situations, drug-involved parents. We face a lot of this, unfortunately, throughout American society today. If you can use if the student is willing to write a journal and share it only with the teacher, if you can just share it that much as an initial step, perhaps later on the teacher could say, listen, the students in your project need to hear this little page or this particular one-day entry from your journal, because that's going to give them a different perspective. In other words, use the trauma as a way in. Now, Monica, I'm sorry to say that's about all I've got to give you, because, I was reflecting on this and I say, well, I can see that, and I can see journals working. God bless. I wish you the best in working with some of these traumatized students.
For example, thinking aloud now, if a teacher, for example, knows about, because in low socioeconomic communities here in Brazil, in the US, with this kind of problems are usual, and teacher knows that something is going on, do you think that he could, for example, start a project-based learning, a project about domestic violence, for example?
That'd be an excellent project.
It's not for you specifically, for that student, but something as more social and political perspective, and then make people more aware about that. Do you think would be a good strategy? Or
well, even elementary kids could do some type of project on domestic violence or abuse at home, and make it an educational message from a fourth grade class to their broader community, and make sure that they have a publication outlet, make sure that there's a local newspaper that's willing to accept a paper or two that's really written by the class. I should emphasize in project-based
activity too.
Exactly. When students see that their work is doing something good for their community, that is another aspect of the motivation. students reciting times tables, or students learning correct grammar in either English or Portuguese. Students will know they need to do that, but it's not as motivating as knowing, hey, what we do here in this project is eventually going to end up as a newspaper article and perhaps a television article. I did have an experience to share there too. This will take just a moment, but I was working in a school in a town called Whitwell, Virginia. And that particular area in the Appalachian Mountain was entirely Caucasian. They didn't have many African Americans. They had no Jewish individuals. And a history teacher and an English teacher were trying to teach about the Holocaust at the end of World War II. 6 million dead Jews in a concentration camp. They came with a brilliant idea. They said, we're going to send our kids into the community and ask for paper clips. Literally go to local businesses with the idea that one paperclip represented one individual, Jewish individual, who disappeared during World War II, probably in the concentration camps. And it was just a local project. It exploded. The media, a Nashville television station, heard about this project and put a little story on it. It was called Paperclips. Hollywood movie stars started sending in collections of 1,000 paper clips. And I read some of these letters. Paul Newman sent in 1,000 paper clips and said, please remember my aunt, I'm forgetting the name here, but my Aunt Sophie, who disappeared in 1944. So you get, a little bit of publication emphasis results in a phenomenal project. That project ended up with HBO making a movie about it called Paperclips. When I was working up there, the neatest thing that happened, Jewish individuals from New York City called this little town, Whitwell, Virginia. And they didn't ask if they could come. They told the town, we're going to come and talk to your kids. Just make it work out. These Jewish individuals still had tattoos on their arms. They were individuals who had been in concentration camps and lived. They did say, tell us where Whitwell is. We can't find you on the map. It was a tiny little town there in Appalachia. But they came down there. And when they were there, they were welcomed by the community, spoke in churches, spoke to the schools, spoke to the students. And then they said, we have a gift for you. In Germany today, there's a railroad car. It was actually used to transport Jews into Auschwitz. And we're going to present this to Whitwell, Virginia schools. They put that railroad car on a ship, sent it across the Atlantic, placed it at the high school in Whitwell, Virginia. And today there's something like 6,000 paper clips. Excuse me, I think it's 60,000 paper clips in that railroad car. It is the monument to victims of the Holocaust in Whitwell, Virginia. That is the power of a project. And I do encourage those of you in Brazil, look up a movie called Paperclips by HBO.
That's
the
great.
power of these projects is phenomenal.
I think this, what we just made you commented, answers the question from Bianca Ruskowski, I hope I said right, and Claudia Ladeira, because they made a question about, you talk in your video about how to prepare for the workforce, but now they ask, what about its contribution to the students' citizenship development? I think that's, we engaged that.
I'm glad I gave you. I was not connecting that with this question, but that's exactly the answer. It's phenomenal too. When you think about it, those students in Whitwell, Virginia, those students are probably 20 years old now, 25 years old and out of school. They will remember that Paperclips project for the rest of their lives. They will have a different understanding of what 6 million deaths really looks like. And it was a phenomenal project. And like I say, I got to see the railroad car and read some of those letters.
Something connected with your video, also talking about motivation, how these projects, they keep in your mind during decades.
Yes.
This make meaning to the school. That's I think what is important.
Well, particularly when students see that their work is contributing to their community. Even the second graders in that part, in the video, the little example, they saw that their work was contributing to their community and improving that local park. That's powerful learning.
Yeah. Patrícia Ribeiro and Fernanda Bock, they made a question can we apply PBL strategies in any field of knowledge or school disciplines? Can it be used to integrate the different disciplines?
Well, we got a kind of yes and no answer. Project-based learning very much can be used to integrate different disciplines. With that said, and so I strongly encourage that. In a project, there should be examples of communication skills, whether they're Web 2.0 or simply students writing in a journal or writing out, communication with each other or writing an article for a newspaper. But there should also be mathematics. There should be science involvement in it. So the integration of disciplines, project-based learning is dependent on that. And with that said, there are certain disciplines that are more challenging. For example, I think about, and perhaps I'm biased, my wife has her PhD in mathematics. I always, and I did a number of work in teaching math. I think math can be more challenging to wrap your head around how to do project-based learning within mathematics, because so much of mathematics really is, some of it has to be rote learning. Some of it has to be memory. And these types of things don't lend themselves. They can be used as a tool in a project, but when you are looking at that list of math standards for grade 9 or 14-year-old students or what have you, you pretty much got to cover those standards. So there are certain subjects that I think you can do some projects in, but some of it, and perhaps the best answer to this question is implementation. If I was teaching as a history teacher, one of my teaching certifications, I could see that I could do almost the entire social studies curriculum as a combination of social studies and language, English language in our case, Portuguese in yours. However, if I put on my mathematics hat and say, okay, how do I do math? I would have to think in terms of some projects and some of the units and other mathematical units taught in a more traditional fashion, simply because I think math. Now, science is a good project-based learning field, but mathematics can be particularly challenging. Music is another one. How do you teach music appreciation as a project? I mean, to learn music, you're generally going to play an instrument. That requires kind of some rote skills, some memory. So there are certain disciplines in which PBL is probably doesn't need to be the dominant instructional strategy. It can certainly be a supplemental one. I hope that answers the question. Excellent question.
Yeah. Marlos Melo made a question. How can PBL contribute to the teacher's professional development?
I love that question when I looked at it, because I had not really, I hate to say I hadn't thought about that, but Marlos, you've asked, is it Marlos? Marlos, you've asked a question there that I had to reflect on here.
And this is a good question, right? So
it's excellent question. Yes. I'm giving a first blush,
think about it.
Giving a first blush answer here. Perhaps in reflection, I think, okay, well, why could the professional development could both be a study of project-based learning and a project that the teachers themselves do. For example, teachers collectively brainstorming instructional issues in their particular school or their particular community can be a powerful thing. And if they can brainstorm, and say, okay, what do we see as 5 implementation issues for how we can improve education? Perhaps one of them is the first topic we talked about. How can we get more internet connectivity and increased device availability, mobile learning capability here? That may be one of the issues, but if teachers identify 3 issues and say, okay, these are 3 things that prevent us from doing the best job we could for these students, how do we solve these? Which one of those 3 things can we attack? There are some that are going to be political. There's some that are going to be, if you're in a school that's 200 miles from anywhere with no internet capability, okay, well, that's not going to be something you can do. But can you do increased involvement of the community coming into the schools? Can you do increased use of encyclopedia or other tools that are not internet dependent? So my thinking on that question, Marlos, is perhaps project-based learning could be the professional development for that group of teachers, not only to learn about it, but to actually do it and say, okay, let's identify 3 issues here that prevent us from being a more effective school. And then we're going to pick the one that we think we can attack effectively this year. Make it a year-long project and see what can come of that. And I hate to say that's kind of my first blush example of that question. That was an excellent question, again, as many of them are.
Well, we have just a few minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we are over time, but we can have more 2 or 3 minutes. Yep. But before, I want to register that one of the questions we selected was made by Eduardo Gallardo, but I consider that the answer was mixed up in the questions before, like the ones about the indigenous population that you work with and technology and things like that. Because Eduardo asked about well-succeeded strategies to work with disabled students in remote settings.
Yes.
So I think as you talk about your experience there and also about the trauma situation, I think we are
address that somewhat.
In that we answered the point raised by Eduardo. But there is a last question from Daniel Carvalho. That is a more specific question. Mm-hmm. About the PBL as a strategy or a method, whatever. Considering that PBL strategies need that the students bring previous knowledge to the activities, what to do when the students lack some pre-required knowledge to the project?
Again, another great question. And the answer to that is in both simple and complex. The simple part, as teachers, and every teacher knows this, we have to start where the students are. We can plan the most beautiful, perfect, wonderful project, or we can find one on the internet. Projects are all over. Go to a website, find a project. But if the students cannot do the basics required by that project, you're going to have to back up. You're going to have to go. We need to start where the students are. Now, with that said, there is a quick learning curve in project-based learning for two groups, students and teachers. Once students do 1, 2, or 3 projects where they are collectively working to identify a problem, developing a timeline, developing some areas in which they need to do research and need to answer specific questions, identifying artifacts that they want to see evolve from the project. As students get used to this set of skills, they're going to become more efficient at it. Teachers will likewise become more comfortable giving students, shall I say, freedom. As I said earlier, it's a different mindset teaching this way, but I don't encourage teachers to jump into the most tough student-independent, student voice projects, from day one. Teachers should move into this at a pace that's comfortable for the teacher. Let the teacher determine the level of student choice and student voice. Perhaps the teacher generates the primary question and then gives the students an opportunity to kind of brainstorm and answer, as opposed to telling the students, okay, we need to find a question that addresses this, So I'd encourage them to move slowly in it and be comfortable. What those teachers I've talked to said that both the students and the teachers learn this mindset and get better on it fairly quickly.
Yeah, that's great. You teacher is part of the group. Don't forget that.
Teacher has got a learning curve too, and it's going to be a great teacher. One thing to share. I've run into many teachers that look back at involvement in project-based learning and said, I don't know why I taught so long without doing this. The ideas have been there, but I have never heard of a teacher said, I tried project-based learning and it just didn't work for me. Because generally if a teacher has said that to me, before a teacher would say that to me in a workshop, they've already said it to their colleagues. And 1 or 2 of those colleagues have said, hey, wait a minute, let's cut back. Let's move back from this dream project and give the teacher a little more control and the students a little less, and move into it slowly and take the students along with you. So, but there's a learning curve for both.
Yeah. We ended our time. It was a really nice talk, and I thank you very much, Professor Bender, for being here and sharing your ideas and thoughts.
It has been my honor, and again, accept my apology for yesterday. I'm very honored to talk with your group of educators there, and look forward to doing it in the future, perhaps.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for being here, and see you next time, next session.
Thank you. Have a great conference.
Yeah.